As descendants of survivors from the 1915 Armenian Genocide, it is often very difficult for us to piece together our family histories. Many of our ancestors were massacred, forced from their homes on short notice, deported into the desert, and those who survived had to rebuild themselves in foreign lands. Relationships were torn apart, pictures lost, histories forgotten, and really only breadcrumbs were left for us descendants of those survivors to piece together their lives. In 2015, my grandmother Doreen passed away, leaving the family boxes of documents, pictures, and artifacts that my ancestors were somehow able to bring out of the Ottoman Empire during the Armenian Genocide. Among these pictures were many that we recognized: our great-grandparents, their siblings, people from our direct family line. But there were many that we did not know who they were. There's nobody left alive to explain them to us. And it was sad to think that their stories and their lives and their struggles were really lost to history, and nobody remembered them. Among these images was this photo. Nobody in my family could identify anybody in this image. All I could see was there was a date, 1912, Bitlis. And in this image is a family with no history that we could trace, no relation to our family that we were aware of, until we scanned the image, zoomed in on the picture that the woman is holding. And by looking at that picture, I was able to notice it was a photo of my great-great-grandfather, Martyros Gashagortzian, his wife Christina, and their son Haig, and daughter Grace. That helped me to realize that this woman seated must be Martyros' mother, holding a photo of her son and his family who had left for America. And this man seated center must be Martyros' brother. And upon discovering who these people were, this image really haunted me, especially knowing that this photograph was taken in 1912 with the Armenian Genocide only 3 years later. What would happen to this family? What would be their fate? In most situations, this is where the trail would grow cold. This would be all that I would know about this family. All I did know was what happened to my great-great-grandfather, pictured in the photograph his mother was holding. Martyros Gashagortzian, the son of a shoemaker in Bitlis, picked up his family in the year 1900 and moved them to the United States. He likely decided to leave because of the Hamidian massacres of 1894 to 1896, where 300,000 Armenians from various provinces were massacred by government-sanctioned bands of Turks and Kurds. They first stopped in Boston, Massachusetts, where his eldest son Haig was born. They later moved to Fresno, California. He worked as a carpenter in Fresno, and that is where his daughters Grace and Victoria were born. Victoria, my great-grandmother, was born in the year 1907. Victoria went to school and church in Fresno, California. It was at an American church that she met Yervant Magridichian. Yervant was a survivor of the Armenian Genocide himself and the son of the British diplomat and intelligence officer Thomas Magridichian. The first thing Yervant noticed about Victoria was her piano playing at church. He especially loved to hear her play Falling Waters, his favorite piano piece. After a short courtship, Victoria and Yervant were married in 1929. I admire my ancestors' resilience and their ability to create a new life for themselves in a new country. To smile, to laugh, to build together. Many of these relatives went through horrific turmoil to reach the United States, but they were able to thrive despite the trauma they carried. Others were lucky enough to leave the Ottoman Empire before the genocide of 1915, but all of them felt a sense of displacement living in a foreign land. I often wonder how Martyros felt, with this knowledge that his brother, his nieces, his nephew, and his mother were in the Ottoman Empire before the Armenian Genocide. How long did he go without hearing news from them? How long was he made to wonder what their eventual fate was? Eventually, though, Martyros did have word from his family, and he did figure out what their fate was to the best of his knowledge. Upon doing so, he must have seen an advertisement like this one from 1933. There was a move to encourage Armenians to file lawsuits against the Turkish Republic for lands and properties confiscated during the Armenian Genocide. This advertisement itself was found among my family possessions and likely was Martyros Gashagortzians, because it wasn't long until he filed a lawsuit against the Ottoman Empire through the Fresno attorneys Barbour, Kellis, and Buckland. It is because of this lawsuit that I was finally able to put names to the faces in this photograph and to understand what their eventual fate was. This document first listed properties that they owned in the Ottoman Empire in Bitlis, including their shoe shop, their farmland, their carpets, their cattle, farming tools, and more. On another page, Martyros Gashagortzian lists his family, including his brother Haruchun Gashagortzian, who he listed as having been killed in the 1915 deportation. He lists 9 children and their fate. Hoshvart was the son of Haruchun. He was killed in the genocide at the age of 24. Osniv, the oldest daughter, survived the deportations and settled in Aleppo, Syria. Jargis, another son, was killed in the genocide at the age of 21. Simpat, another son, is listed as having been killed. A son, Yetvart, survived the deportations and was believed to be in Diyarbakir. Siranush, another daughter, who at the age of 12 was killed in the 1915 deportation. A son, Haigazun, survived the deportations and lived in a Near East relief orphanage in Yerevan, which at the time was in Russia. A son, Asken, who is at the same orphanage, and a daughter, Arsha Luis, who is in the same orphanage. Upon learning of their fate, this picture haunted me even more, especially this image of the young girl who would have been around 12 at the time of the genocide, which means that this is Siranush, who was killed in the deportations. The oldest daughter, Osniv, pictured here, would have been the daughter who survived and made her way to Aleppo, Syria. The fates of this branch of the family tell a story of misery, death, and struggle, isolation, poverty, and alienation, emblematic of the experience many faced who experienced the Armenian Genocide. Upon learning of these names and fates, I was able to piece together more pieces of this puzzle. We inherited letters from an Osniv in Syria, who I was now able to identify as the daughter of Haruchun Gashagortzian. This would have been my great-grandmother Victoria's cousin. She was one of the survivors of this family, and her letters show the difficulty that survivors from the Armenian Genocide faced. Their lives were not easy. In 1931, she wrote to my great-great-grandmother Christina, "I spend my days crying. I have never felt happiness since my childhood, up to this day. I wonder how my story will end. Dear aunt, you know that there is nothing that can console me here. You are my sole consolation. If you stop supporting me, who else can I rely on? Believe me, mother, every time I'm alone, I start overthinking everything and getting a terrible headache. I start crying and hoping that this is just a dream. I'm all alone in a foreign land. Please send me a photo of you and my uncle Martyros. If I don't hear of you for a long time, I get worried. I need to work to feed me and my son, but how can I do that? Dear aunt, we have been under the protection of an orphanage up to this day, but now that we have left the orphanage, they stopped helping us." In 1936, she writes again to her aunt and uncle, Martyros and Christina. "You know everything about my sufferings I had to face in a foreign country. This year in Aleppo, our days were especially miserable, and we had to overcome a lot of difficulties. There was a lack of food and work. There were thousands of unemployed people. Only God knows what kinds of miserable days we went through. Only your letters and photos comfort me and give me hope. Thank God I have relatives like you. Dear aunt, I found my brother Simbat in Turkey. He is a soldier in Diyarbakir. We maintain correspondence with each other. I received Simbat's letter and yours in one day. I was very happy about that. He wanted to know your address, and I gave him that information so you may receive a letter from him. I told him that my uncle was in America. When he learned that you're all safe and sound, he asked for me to give your address to him. Simpat was one of the sons thought to be dead in the deportations. Osniv also lamented that she got married out of convenience to an Antranik Sarkisian, and at first life was okay, but it soon became difficult. They had one son, Gevor, who they were not able to care for, and he ended up in an orphanage for some time. Osniv's letters are full of mourning and lament at being alone in an area that she did not know, far away from her family and friends. She wrote of the isolation she felt with nobody to talk to. In her letters, you can see the sorrow that she faced as she waited for her aunts and uncles across the world who were dispersed through the Armenian Genocide to send her correspondences. Many of her surviving relatives did not communicate her. Martyros and Christina continued to correspond with her over decades, but Osniv often complained about the length it took for her to get their letters and how isolated and sad she felt. This was not the only relative I was able to track down from this family. Simpat, who was thought to be dead, ended up surviving the deportations, as his sister had wrote to my great-great-grandparents. Simpat wrote to Victoria, my great-grandmother, in 1956, "I was saved from the awful deportations and massacres of 1915 and could save my life under a Turkish name, so I am called Jamal. For years I lived as a fugitive from town to town, county to county, and now I live in Istanbul. I feel myself alone in the world. I'm sending you my photos as a remembrance of me. Please send your photos to me as well to ease my longing for you." It's uncertain what happened to Simpat in Istanbul and his sister Osniv in Aleppo, Syria. It is uncertain what happened to those who stayed behind in orphanages in Armenia, and it's uncertain if any descendants of these branches are still alive, and if I have relatives in Syria, Armenia, or Turkey. As for Victoria, my great-grandmother, she and Yervant raised 3 girls together, including my grandmother Doreen. Somewhere along the way, contact was lost between our relatives across the seas. Though our family is fractured, their memories remain in my heart as an act of defiance against the Ottoman Turks' attempt at erasing us, and against the modern Turkish Republic's denial of the full history of this erasure. My hope for this video and this story is to keep their memory alive. These letters from the few who survived, the family picture, and Martyros' legal document may constitute all that remains of Haruchun's family. They were massacred, torn from their homeland, their lands and properties confiscated. I wanted to share their story to preserve their memory, as they were so nearly lost to history. I do not know if there are any surviving descendants of these children somewhere in Syria, Turkey, or Armenia. Who would remember these faces if not for this picture? And who would remember the struggle if not for the letters in my grandmother's boxes? Their story is but one example of the devastation the Ottoman Turks inflicted upon Armenian families during the genocide. But it is also an example of their failure. That I'm sitting here today with this picture of the Gashagortzians in my hand and the memory of Haruchun, Jargis, Khoshvart, and Siranush in my heart, and that Armenians around the world continue to gather on April 24th to keep the memories and stories of their ancestors alive year after year after year, is a testament to this failure. We are still here, and we still remember those who we've lost. Several years ago, I wrote an op-ed about my missing Gashagortzian relatives. It was through breadcrumbs from my ancestors that I was able to piece together this family story, and I'm trying to leave breadcrumbs myself. Part of me is hoping that one of the descendants of this lost branch, if there are any, will find these breadcrumbs and make contact with me, reuniting our two families and mending the rupture that the Armenian Genocide created in our family tree. It is a small hope, but one that I carry with me.